In the psychology of the unconscious, few distinctions are as vital and as frequently misunderstood as the difference between solitude and isolation. To the superficial observer, both appear identical: a person alone, detached from social life, removed from companionship. Yet from the standpoint of depth psychology, these two states arise from entirely different psychic movements and lead to radically different outcomes. The loner who keeps no friends is often assumed to be isolated, deprived, or deficient, but this assumption reveals more about the fears of the collective than the reality of the individual psyche. Isolation is a condition imposed from the outside. It occurs when an individual is cut off from meaningful contact against their inner will. Psychologically, isolation weakens the ego. It produces anxiety, resentment, dependency, and often a desperate hunger for validation. The isolated individual is haunted by the absence of others because their sense of self has not yet stabilized internally. Their identity depends upon reflection, feedback, and recognition. Remove the social mirror, and the ego begins to dissolve into uncertainty. This is why forced isolation so often leads to psychological breakdown, neurosis, or exaggerated fantasies of persecution and rejection. Solitude, however, arises from an inner necessity. It is chosen, not suffered. In solitude, the individual does not feel abandoned by the world, but temporarily released from it. The psychic energy that would normally flow outward into relationships, roles, and social obligations turns inward. This inward turning is not regression, but concentration. It is the psyche withdrawing libido from external objects in order to confront internal ones. When a person enters true solitude, they are not empty, they are occupied by images, symbols, memories, and archetypal forces that demand attention. The loner who keeps no friends often lives in this state of solitude rather than isolation. Their withdrawal is not driven by fear of people, but by a saturation of inner experience. Ordinary social interaction, which for many serves as stimulation or reassurance, can feel to them like noise interrupting a vital inner dialogue. Such individuals may appear calm, detached, or emotionally distant, yet this appearance is misleading. Their emotions have not disappeared, they have been internalized. They are lived inwardly, processed slowly, and rarely displayed for social consumption. From the perspective of analytical psychology, this condition frequently marks the beginning or continuation of the individuation process. Individuation is the movement toward becoming a whole, differentiated self, distinct from the collective identity. This process cannot unfold entirely in the presence of constant social immersion. The collective exerts a powerful hypnotic influence. It rewards conformity and punishes deviation, often subtly. For the psyche to hear its own voice, it must at times step away from the crowd. The loner who keeps no friends has often done this not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. This is why such individuals are frequently misunderstood. Society interprets withdrawal as rejection and difference as judgment. The collective ego assumes that what it values, constant connection, shared norms, visible engagement, must be universally necessary. When someone does not require these things, it creates unease. The loner becomes a mirror reflecting the unconscious dependency of others. People may feel dismissed, threatened, or unsettled in their presence, not because the loner has done anything hostile, but because their independence exposes a weakness. The collective prefers not to see. Solitude also allows for a different relationship with time. Social life fragments attention. It demands rapid emotional responses, constant adaptation, and ongoing performance. In solitude, time thickens, thoughts deepen, contradictions are allowed to coexist without immediate resolution. The psyche gains the space to hold tension, and it is precisely from sustained tension that psychological growth emerges. The loner who keeps no friends often tolerates ambiguity far better than those who rely on group consensus to stabilize their worldview. Yet solitude is not comfort. It is demanding. Without social distractions, the individual must face their own shadow, their fears, resentments, and unlived potentials. This confrontation is exhausting and, at times, terrifying. Many people flee from solitude not because they love society, but because they fear themselves. The loner who remains alone has often already crossed this threshold. They have discovered that inner conflict, once faced, is less destructive than inner avoidance. This is why solitude produces depth. while isolation produces distortion. Isolation collapses the psyche inward without structure. Solitude builds an inner architecture. The loner who keeps no friends is not drifting aimlessly. They are often engaged in an unspoken labor of self-integration. Their silence is not emptiness, but containment. Their distance is not rejection, but boundary. To confuse solitude with isolation is to misunderstand one of the most important stages of psychological development. The friendless loner is not necessarily broken, antisocial, or incomplete. They may simply be at a point where the inner world has become more real, more urgent, and more demanding than the outer one, and where companionship, if it is to exist at all, must meet them at depth rather than distraction. In analytical psychology, the concept of the shadow refers to all that the conscious personality refuses to acknowledge about itself. These rejected elements do not disappear, they accumulate in the unconscious, where they gain energy and autonomy. Most individuals manage this uncomfortable inner material by projecting it outward. They locate their darkness in others, in enemies, in social scapegoats, and in moral judgments that allow them to feel pure by comparison. The loner who keeps no friends often represents a fundamentally different psychological configuration, one in which projection has been withdrawn and the shadow has been brought closer to consciousness. When an individual begins to integrate the shadow, their relationship with themselves changes profoundly. They no longer require constant moral alignment with a group to feel secure. They become slower to judge, more hesitant to condemn, and less eager to signal virtue. This does not make them immoral. It makes them complex. Complexity, however, is deeply unsettling to the collective psyche, which prefers clear categories of good and evil, ally and enemy, acceptable and unacceptable. The shadow-rich personality disrupts these categories simply by existing. Such individuals often radiate a quiet intensity. They are not emotionally volatile, nor are they easily impressed or offended. This emotional density can feel threatening to those who rely on social validation to regulate their inner world. The shadow-rich person does not need others to carry their unwanted traits. They have already assumed this burden themselves. As a result, they cannot be easily manipulated through guilt, praise, or fear of exclusion. This autonomy is frequently misinterpreted as arrogance or coldness, when in fact it is the natural outcome of psychological responsibility. The fear such individuals evoke is rarely conscious. People may say they feel uneasy around them without being able to explain why. This unease arises because the shadow-rich personality does not participate fully in the shared illusions that bind groups together. Every society maintains itself through unspoken agreements about what must not be seen, felt, or questioned. The loner, who has confronted their shadow, violates these agreements silently. They do not argue, they do not preach. Their very presence suggests that it is possible to live without denial, and this suggestion destabilizes those who are still dependent on repression. Historically, such figures have often been labeled as dangerous, strange, or untrustworthy, not because they commit harm, but because they cannot be easily predicted. The collective values predictability above truth. A person whose inner life is integrated rather than fragmented does not react reflexively. They pause, they reflect, they respond rather than react. This delay alone can provoke suspicion, as if depth itself were a form of concealment. The shadow-rich personality is also less inclined toward shallow intimacy. They know the weight of human nature and therefore approach relationships with caution. This selectivity can be mistaken for emotional unavailability, yet it is often rooted in responsibility rather than avoidance. Having seen their own capacity for darkness, they do not idealize others. They are not seduced by charm or appearances. They seek authenticity, and authenticity is rare. When it is absent, solitude becomes preferable to compromise. This condition also alters how aggression is expressed. Many people discharge their aggression socially through competition, gossip, moral outrage, or tribal conflict. The shadow-rich individual has internalized much of this energy. They experience aggression as a psychological force to be understood and transformed, not simply acted out. This containment gives them composure under pressure, but it also intensifies their inner life. The battles others fight externally, they fight within. It is precisely this internalization that makes such individuals both powerful and potentially dangerous. Not to others, but to themselves if unconsciousness returns. The integrated shadow requires ongoing awareness. Without reflection, it can harden into cynicism or detachment. Yet when consciousness is maintained, the shadow becomes a source of realism, resilience, and ethical depth. The person is no longer naive about goodness, nor seduced by evil. They stand in between, holding the tension of opposites. To encounter such a personality is to encounter someone who has paid a psychological price that most are unwilling to pay. They have sacrificed innocence for awareness, belonging for truth, and comfort for integration. Society senses this cost intuitively and responds with ambivalence, fascination mixed with fear. The loner who keeps no friends is not frightening because they lack empathy, but because they possess it without illusion. And empathy without illusion is a rare and unsettling force in a world that survives by looking away. Human relationships serve a vital psychological function in the early stages of development. Through others, the ego learns its boundaries, its values, and its sense of reality. We become someone by being seen, reflected, and recognized. Friendship, belonging, and shared identity are not superficial needs. They are developmental necessities. Yet psychology does not end with belonging. There comes a stage in the life of certain individuals where the mechanisms that once supported growth begin to restrain it. At this point, social dependency no longer nourishes the psyche but drains it, and the individual is compelled, often unwillingly, to move beyond it. Social dependency is rooted in the ego's need for stabilization. The ego is fragile in its early formation and seeks reinforcement through approval, agreement, and emotional mirroring. Groups provide this reinforcement efficiently. They tell us who we are, what we should value, and how we should behave. For many people, this structure remains necessary throughout life. Their psyche remains oriented toward the collective, and there is nothing pathological in this. Psychological health does not require isolation. However, for some individuals, the psyche demands a deeper foundation, one that cannot be supplied externally. When this demand arises, it is often experienced as discomfort rather than clarity. The individual may feel bored by conversations that once excited them, constrained by relationships that once felt supportive, and restless in environments that previously provided comfort. This is not arrogance, nor is it emotional numbness. It is the psyche signaling that identity can no longer be borrowed. What once functioned as nourishment has become repetition. At this stage, continued dependence on social validation threatens psychological stagnation. The individual who outgrows social dependency begins to experience relationships differently. They no longer seek others to confirm their worth or define their values. Instead, they approach relationships from a position of internal reference. This shift can feel like loss. Friendships may dissolve not through conflict but through irrelevance. Shared narratives no longer align. Emotional exchanges feel scripted. The individual becomes aware of how much social interaction is governed by unconscious contracts. I will affirm you if you affirm me. I will belong if I do not disrupt. To a psyche seeking truth, these contracts feel suffocating. This is where the loner who keeps no friends often emerges, not as a rejection of humanity, but as a refusal to live psycholo. Gically on credit. Such individuals are no longer willing to outsource their sense of self. They do not abandon relationships lightly. Often, they have loved deeply, participated fully, and given generously. But at some point, they recognize that continued immersion in social dependency requires the suppression of inner truth. The cost becomes too high. Outgrowing social dependency also alters one's relationship with emotion. Many social bonds are maintained through shared emotional regulation. We soothe one another's anxieties, reinforce each other's narratives, and collectively avoid uncomfortable questions. When an individual becomes capable of regulating their emotional life internally, the need for constant interpersonal exchange diminishes. Silence becomes tolerable. Solitude becomes spacious rather than empty. This shift is deeply unsettling to others who may interpret it as withdrawal or rejection, when in reality it is maturation. Such individuals often develop a heightened sensitivity to meaning. They are less interested in frequency of contact and more concerned with depth of connection. Quantity loses its appeal. A single, authentic exchange carries more psychological weight than a dozen superficial ones. This selectivity further reduces the number of relationships that feel viable. The individual may appear friendless, but internally they are discerning rather than deprived. However, this transition is not without suffering. Outgrowing social dependency often involves grief. The individual must mourn not only lost relationships, but lost versions of themselves. The identity formed through others must be relinquished. This can create a period of psychological homelessness where the old structures have fallen away and the new ones have not yet solidified. During this phase, loneliness can coexist with clarity. The person may feel isolated on the surface, yet inwardly aligned. From the perspective of individuation, this stage is unavoidable for those whose psyche demands wholeness rather than belonging. Individuation does not abolish relationship, but it transforms it. Relationships are no longer used to complete the self, but to encounter the other as they truly are. This requires equality, honesty, and mutual consciousness, conditions that many social environments cannot support. The loner who keeps no friends has often passed through this threshold and discovered that most relationships available to them require a regression they can no longer sustain. Their solitude is not a protest, but a consequence. They are no longer dependent on being liked, included, or understood to feel real. Their sense of self has shifted from external reinforcement to inner coherence. And once this shift occurs, returning to social dependency feels less like connection and more like self-betrayal. When an individual no longer relies on social structures to stabilize their identity, a unique form of psychological power begins to emerge. The friendless mind is not powerful in the sense of dominance or control over others, but in autonomy, endurance, and inner authority. This power is invisible to those who measure strength through popularity, influence, or emotional reach, yet it is precisely this invisibility that allows it to operate without distortion. The loner who keeps no friends often carries a degree of self-possession that cannot be granted by any group, and this self-possession alters how they move through the world. One of the primary strengths of the friendless mind is its resistance to collective emotion. Groups amplify feeling. Fear, excitement, outrage, and enthusiasm spread rapidly among people and often override reflection. The individual who stands apart is less susceptible to this contagion. Their judgments are SL, our, their reactions restrained. This does not make them indifferent, it makes them deliberate. In moments of crisis, such individuals may appear eerily calm, not because they lack concern, but because their psyche is not immediately hijacked by external pressure. This autonomy grants a capacity for sustained attention. Without the constant interruptions of social obligation, the friendless mind can remain focused for long periods. Thoughts are allowed to mature. Ideas are not abandoned prematurely for the sake of agreement or approval. This depth of concentration often leads to original insight, creative expression, or a refined ethical stance. Many of the most transformative ideas in history have emerged from individuals who stood at the margins, not because they despised society, but because society could not accommodate the tension their thinking required. However, this same autonomy carries risk. Without relational mirrors, the psyche can become self-referential. Reflection may turn into rumination. Independence can harden into rigidity. The absence of external challenge may allow certain blind spots to persist unnoticed. The friendless mind must therefore cultivate an inner dialogue that is honest and self-correcting. Without this discipline, solitude can slide into isolation and autonomy into alienation. Another hidden power of the friendless mind lies in its ethical independence. Social groups often enforce morality through reward and punishment. Approval is granted for conformity, and exclusion threatens deviation. The loner who keeps no friends is largely immune to these mechanisms. Their values are not upheld because they are popular, but because they are integrated. Such individuals may act ethically even when no one is watching, not out of fear or pride, but because their conscience is internally anchored. This internal morality can make them unpredictable. They may refuse to participate in collective cruelty disguised as tradition or necessity. They may withdraw from environments that demand compromise of integrity. This refusal is often interpreted as judgment or superiority, when in fact it reflects a refusal to betray inner alignment. Society tends to distrust those it cannot coerce, and ethical autonomy is one of the most difficult forms of independence to tolerate. Yet the friendless mind also faces a profound psychological danger: emotional atrophy. Human beings are relational creatures, and even the most individuated psyche requires encounter. Without some form of meaningful relationship, the capacity for empathy can diminish, not through cruelty, but through underuse. The loner must therefore remain vigilant, ensuring that solitude does not erode their capacity to feel with others. Depth without warmth becomes sterile, insight without connection becomes barren. There is also the risk of unconscious inflation. When an individual separates from the collective, they may begin to identify too strongly with their autonomy. The ego may mistake independence for superiority. This is a subtle danger, as it disguises itself as self-sufficiency. True individuation is not contempt for others, but responsibility toward oneself and the world. The friendless mind must remember that separation is a phase, not an identity. Despite these risks, the friendless mind occupies a necessary psychological position within society. Such individuals act as silent correctives. They reveal by their existence that another way of being is possible. They demonstrate that meaning need not be negotiated, that conscience need not be outsourced, and that identity can survive without applause. Their influence is rarely direct. It appears in quiet decisions, subtle refusals, and long-term consequences rather than immediate recognition. To beware of the loner who keeps no friends is to recognize that you are encountering someone who is not governed by the usual incentives. They cannot be easily persuaded, intimidated, or seduced by collective rewards. This does not make them enemies of society, but it does make them outsiders to its illusions. Approaching such a mind requires humility, patience, and depth. Shallow engagement will not reach them, and superficial judgments will reveal more about the observer than the observed. The loner who keeps no friends stands at the edge of the collective, not because they have failed to belong, but because they have moved beyond unconscious belonging. What appears from the outside as withdrawal is often, from within, a discipline turning toward psychological truth. Such individuals force us to confront an uncomfortable possibility that much of what we call connection is dependence, much of what we call morality is imitation, and much of what we call identity is borrowed rather than discovered. They unsettle society not through action but through presence, because they demonstrate that a human being can survive and even deepen without constant social reinforcement. To misunderstand them is easy, to fear them is common, yet the real danger does not lie in the loner's solitude but in the collective's refusal to understand it. When we label all aloneness as pathology, we erase the vital role of inner development. When we demand constant visibility, agreement, and participation, we discourage the very psychological processes that lead to maturity, responsibility, and ethical autonomy. The friendless mind is not a rejection of humanity, but a confrontation with it at its most fundamental level. At the same time, solitude is not a virtue in itself. Psychological depth does not arise from isolation alone, but from conscious engagement with the inner world. The loner who walks this path must remain vigilant, balancing independence with humility, autonomy with compassion, and insight with human warmth. Individuation is not an escape from relationship, but a preparation for it, one that transforms connection from a necessity into a choice. To beware of loners who keep no friends is therefore to beware of simplifications about others and about ourselves. They remind us that the psyche has its own rhythms, that growth often requires withdrawal, and that true strength is not always loud, visible, or socially rewarded. In their silence, they carry a question that society must eventually face: whether we dare to know ourselves without the comforting noise of the crowd.